Through the years, I've been a part of many discussions and debates about social issues and what we should do about them. And inevitably, in these discussions, I would be asked, well, what's your solution? And I would say, let's not rush with the solutions. Let's define the problem. And then I would say, if in my lifetime we can agree on the definitions of the problems, then I'm not too worried about solutions. Solutions would flow from the proper definition of the problem and the common understanding of those definitions. That's the situation we have in defining the problem. Sometimes, because we don't define problems appropriately, we can have problematic discourses. For example, in recent years, there have been a lot of calls for individuals and communities and folk around the country to get together and have discussions about race, discussions about racism, some dialogues on race and racism. But too often, these discussions become problematic because what happens when you have a small circle of people having these discussions, what happens is that these things are approached from an individual or a personal perspective, such that individuals who are participating are called upon to confess their own biases and their own prejudices. And those can be very uncomfortable for the participants. And I would add, they're also unproductive. How do we arrive at that situation in defining the problem that way? I would say this is a result of what's called the institutionalized thought structure. The institutionalized thought structure is the structured way of seeing things. It's the social structuring of knowledge. It's the ways of thinking about issues. It's the ways of thinking about social problems. And it's the ways of thinking about race and racism. Now, there are some assumptions that I want to go over with you that are problematic with the ways of thinking about these issues that abound in the country today. Number one is that racism is an issue that doesn't exist anymore, that has disappeared. Well, that's problematic because that's not true. Another assumption, a definition about race and racism is that racism is something that bigoted people do intentionally. That might very well be true, but racism is a lot more than that. Another issue is the generally held way we approach this. The assumption is that prejudice causes racism, that individuals are prejudiced, and if they're prejudiced, then they are likely to commit racism. And then the assumption is that we want to cure racism or eliminate racism, we have to cure or eliminate prejudice. That might be helpful, but I want to suggest to you this evening that the error goes the other way, from racism to prejudice. First, we must understand that individuals are not born prejudiced. It has to come from somewhere. So therefore, if we start with something that's developed later, we're starting too late, I would argue. We need to look at the arrow that goes from racism to prejudice. Usually, one would assume that prejudice develops as a result of one's life experiences, which may have something to do with being in an environment of racism. And if we assume that, and if you go along with me there, many people would say, well, okay, we need to focus on individuals. We need to focus on individual racism. We need to focus on individuals committing racism and deal with that. Now, that's well and good. However, we can be led astray by following the individual racism dimension. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, a graduate student of mine conducted a study to try to determine why was it that African Americans in this major American city received so many more traffic tickets than whites. And so what he did was establish study areas. One, looking at a thoroughfare that was predominantly used by whites, and another thoroughfare that was predominantly used by blacks. He found that the thoroughfare used by whites had many fewer traffic tickets than the one used by blacks. Even though, and he had a radar gun to prove this, the speed and speed in on the predominantly white thoroughfare was much higher than that on the predominantly black thoroughfare. He found another thing. That is that the police deployed many more cars on the black thoroughfare than they did the so-called white thoroughfare. So it seems to be a result of the deployment of these police cars. So if you follow me this far, then it would seem that we can begin to think about racism as being an attribute of institutions. Institutions in our society, like criminal justice, like education, like health, like employment, and so on. Now, if we were to go further and say, how do we remedy this problem? Well, if you take all of the policemen who are on the black thoroughfare and put them through months of sensitivity and diversity training, I can assure you there will be no changes. Blacks will still be targeted for ticketing unless the policies and practices of the police department are changed. So that's what we have to pay some attention to. We have here an issue of problem definition. So we need to spend some time thinking about what is the nature of the problem and also defining the problem appropriately. There are people in our history who can suggest how we do that. John Dewey says that a problem well defined is a problem half solved. Einstein used to say if you give him an hour to solve a problem, he's going to spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and defining the problem, and the other 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to focus on institutions. It's very simple why we need to do this. Not too many years ago, racial discrimination was legal in this country, and it was practiced widely. The way it was carried out was through the institutions in society. And if those institutions have not been changed, it is likely that they are producing racism now. Another reason for focusing on institutions is that the impact of racism that spews forth from institutions is much greater than that comes from individuals. Yes, individual racism is something we have to be concerned about. However, the impact of institutional racism is much, much greater. So if we define the problem appropriately, and if we focus on institutions, then we remove individuals from the equation, and so we can have civil discourse. We can have discussions about race and racism, because we can be discussing something that is much larger than the impact of any individual. Also, individuals can have this civil discourse because they're not being called on to confess their bias and so on. And finally, I would add that if we do that, then we are on the way to solving the major problem of racial discrimination. Thank you.